In response to a viewer request, today I'd like to give you some ideas of how to approach Chopin's wonderful Nocturne in E-flat major. Are you sitting comfortably? Then let's begin. Hi, this is Tommy with Tommy's Piano Corner, the place for returning pianists, or indeed anybody who loves piano, to share tips and ideas of how to get the best from this great hobby. If it's your first trip here, then please do think about subscribing. Simply hit the little icon in the bottom right hand corner of your screen now, and it's all done for you. Chopin's Nocturne in E-flat major, so that's Opus 9 number 2, is perhaps one of his most well-known pieces, both with pianists and non-pianists alike. It's one of those things that's great to have in your fingers so that you can play for friends and family when asked. Also, it fits in that magic barrier of less than 4 minutes long, which people will listen to quite happily without getting distracted, shall we say. But as pianists, there's also a lot of very similar material in it, so the learning process is that much easier. Let's get straight into it. This beautiful piece is in E-flat major, so 3 flats, and is in 12/8 time. Now, this might seem an odd time signature at first, however, when you think of it in 4 groups of 3/8 notes, it makes a lot of sense. Henle has rated this as a 6, so the top end of their medium difficulty rating. This, I think, makes it accessible to many of us. Before jumping into the details, let's have a little look at the structure. We can think of the first 12 bars as being a section that is then almost repeated in the next 12 bars and finished off with an 11-bar coda. However, when we look at the 12-bar repeated sections, we can see that Chopin also splits these into 3 in a beautifully symmetrical manner. He has an initial theme that is 4 bars long. He then echoes that in the next 4 bars, so he doesn't repeat it, but you can hear that the underlying structure is very, very similar. He then adds another 4 bars, almost, if you like, as a mini coda to link everything together. Even in the coda, Chopin still uses this same echo principle, where the theme in the first 4 bars is echoed again in the next 4. And then finally we have the beautiful little cadenza that takes us to the end. Perhaps the best place to start with this piece is the melody, and I would definitely spend some time studying it right hand only initially to properly appreciate the phrase markings. Let's concentrate first on the first 12 bars. In terms of obvious technical difficulties, we have the ornaments. We've got a turn in bar 2, we've got 2 mordants in bar 5, we've got a trill in bar 7 and a grace note in bar 8. However, I wouldn't necessarily start focusing on the ornamentation only at first. Let's think in bigger lines about the melody. It's one of those bel canto, so beautifully singing melodies for which Chopin is so well known. When we examine the score, we can in fact see the intricate phrasing that Chopin has included for us. To understand it properly, I would first play the melody without ornaments and exaggerate the phrasing in groups of, say, 4 bars. By exaggerating, I mean to practice mostly without pedal and leave an audible gap between Chopin's marked phrases, of course making sure you use your intended fingering for this. Now, this is not the way you would seek to perform it by any means, and we will look at alternative ways to implement the phrasing later. There's another interesting thing here too. You might notice that Chopin uses hairpin markings here, which generally means crescendo when the hairpin opens and diminuendo when it closes. However, if we look at bar 6, for example, we'll see that Chopin has an opening hairpin, yet he also marks crescendo in words in the same place. One thing that it's important to realise in his music is that the hairpins can also be used to indicate the application of rubato. As you practice the simplified melody without the ornaments, take these markings also into account as you decide how you're going to shape it. Look, for example, at bar 6. First, we have phrase marks on groups of 16th notes. We also have sforzando markings on some of these 16th notes, plus we have the opening and closing hairpins and a crescendo marked. Now that's an awful lot of information on how Chopin wants us to phrase this one single bar. Once you're really happy with how you're phrasing this melody, then and only then start adding your ornaments, taking care that they don't interrupt the flow that you've practiced without them. Let's take a few moments to talk quickly about the trill on its own. In general, a 1-3 fingering makes the trill easier, as you can manage it largely by rotating your forearm. My score's got 2-3, but personally I prefer 1-3 here. However, for me, the real trick is not so much the trill itself, but how you exit the trill where you've got the grace notes at the end. This, I think, merits plenty of practice. So practice the trill alone, and then practice the exit alone too. I don't think there's necessarily any right or wrong way to do this trill. I think it's open to interpretation, and you may even adopt to use different finger positions for different appearances of it to add some musical interest. Now let's have a look at the left hand. Again, the score tells us quite a lot here. We have a staccato marking on the bass note, followed by a slur on the 2 chords. However, we also have the pedal marked, and so the musical effect we will get here is not a crisp short staccato in the bass, in the typical sense of the term. This notation is used in the vast majority of bars in this piece, and so it's important, I think, to get it right. You might find it worthwhile practicing the left hand alone, paying very particular attention again to the phrasing. To help with the phrasing, you can practice the chord element only, using a downward motion of the wrist on the first chord and an upward motion of the wrist on the second. You might hear this term referred to as a drop roll. Do this in 4-bar sections as you did for the right hand. Work specifically on the chords, and only once you're sure these are beautifully phrased and played together, then start to add in the bass notes. Think also carefully about your fingering here. More often than not, the chord portion can be played with 5-2 first and then 4-2-1 second. However, if you have smaller hands, you might find that this isn't always comfortable, and you might need to resort to 5-1 with 4-2-1 in some bars. Bar 12 breaks the normal pattern in the final 6/8 notes, and so it's worth separate study. Note the staccato markings yet again under a slur. In my score, this is the first time there's no pedal marked. However, I find a touch of pedal with each note works very nicely. Experiment with both options and see how you feel. Now let's put both hands together and also think about the pedal. Our initial right hand practice has got us used to the phrasing that Chopin expects. However, once you add the left hand and the pedal, then it isn't always simple to achieve the phrasing result wanted. For example, there is no audible gap very often, as a phrase will change mid-pedal. However, we have a number of options to make the phrasing we want. If we look at bar 1, we have a phrase that starts on the 5th/8th note, yet a pedal marking on the 4th. I've found that in fact it's possible to move that pedal to the 5th/8th note so that the phrase becomes more evident. Bar 10 is another example where you might choose to use the pedal to emphasize the phrasing. You can release the pedal just after the 4 E flats here. In either case, you might prefer to pedal as written and make the phrase by emphasizing its first note, for example. I'm a believer in what Horowitz said, that the score isn't a Bible and that the music is behind the dots. Elsewhere, you might choose to phrase by using some subtle rubato, for example. As you put both hands together, do so in pairs of phrasing and experiment with different options. So now let's look at the next 12 bars. You'll immediately notice that these are very similar, but far from identical to the first 12 bars. So use the same approach that we took for the first 12 and look at the right hand alone without the ornaments. To see just how subtle Chopin can be with his music, look carefully at bar 14 for example. At first sight, it's identical to bar 6. However, on closer inspection, you can see lots of tiny differences. Look at the first 8th note for example. This has a staccato marking which wasn't present in bar 6. Next, whilst many of the 16th notes are still phrased in groups of 2, the sforzando markings aren't present here. Also, the phrase marking from the top D flat is different. And then don't forget that the hairpins and the crescendo are in slightly different locations. Therefore, Chopin expects this to sound different to bar 6. You'll find these tiny differences in pretty much every phrase too, so look for them, and if necessary, mark them on your score. You could use a coloured highlighter pen, for example, just to jog your memory. Now, we have a couple of tricky measures here that merit specific consideration. First, bar 16 and then bar 24. You can see here Chopin has decided to use 32nd notes, which at first sight might be terrifying. However, they are much more manageable than you might initially think. Most pianists treat these more as fioritura, so that's those little groups of note written in smaller typeset, almost cadenza-like, with quite often odd numerical groups like 11 or 22. To approach them, the first thing is to think about fingering. If there's a fingering marked in your score, try it out. You may well see what look like very odd fingerings. However, these are based on Chopin's own choices of fingering, especially around chromatic passages. Try out plenty of different combinations, and once you decide on one, write it in and stick with it. Hands separately, practice it in small groups of notes. Of course, the groups you use will change depending on the fingering you've chosen. Next, practice it hands together with a steady pace and the notes exactly as written, so 32nd notes perfectly spaced over the 8th notes. Although not necessarily at a strict tempo, by all means slow down to keep it more manageable. However, in performance I think you can think more freely and just let it flow rather than trying to keep everything perfectly aligned. You can practice bar 24 in exactly the same way. We can then add in the ornaments to this later as we did for the previous 12 bars, and just notice specifically the tiny trill in bar 22, where previously Chopin had used mordants. As a reminder, the mordant is more like this, whereas a trill you would play like this. Finally, we can look at the coda. Again, spend some time on the melody and study the phrasing without the ornamentation. Specifically take note of the fact we have, say, dolcissimo very softly, con forza with force, and stretto so stressed. One piece of advice I'd give is that whether or not you generally memorize your pieces, make the effort to memorize from bar 26 onwards. There's a lot of movement in the right and left hands here, so it's much easier if you don't need to worry about which notes you need to play. I would take this phrase by phrase, hands separately, and then hands together. Now let's have a look at the cadenza. Thinking about it from the beginning of bar 32, we have the highest dynamic marking of the piece, fortissimo, on the C flat, and then senza tempo marked, so without time. We then have 12 repeated groups of 4 notes. This is perhaps one of the most difficult parts of the piece. To practice it, I found it helpful to exercise it in different groups. So start a group of 4 on a different note. Also, keep as one longer pattern but accent a different note. There's even an option of practicing it in groups of 6 from different starting points by placing an imaginary fermata at the start of each group. As with the trill, actually perhaps the hardest bit is exiting the pattern at the end, and this is again something that warrants specific practice. I recommend practicing here the final 4 groups and then the next group which exits the pattern. I wouldn't be in a rush to master this. Take your time and spend just a few minutes each day using these exercises initially. As a practice plan for this, I'd first start off spending a few minutes per day on the cadenza alone, even before starting the rest of the piece. I'd also practice separately bars 16 and 24, again independently of the remainder of the piece. Then I pick up the octave section for bar 29 and 30, starting really from the beginning of bar 29 though. If you're not super confident with octaves, take your time here, as wrong notes of course will be ultra noticeable. Afterwards, learn each of the initial 12 bar sections one after another. Follow the phrasing advice I gave so that you feel it and perhaps ensure you put in some indications of where the phrasing changes to jog your memory. Even if you are good at memorising, I'd advise to keep playing from music longer than perhaps you normally would, so that you really ingrain the different phrasing into your mind and don't too quickly convert it to muscle memory where this could be lost. These subtle differences are what turns this from something which can sound very sameish when these details are ignored to something exceptionally beautiful. And then at the end, learn the coda. My logic for organising it like this is that you'll have spent the longest elapsed time with the most difficult parts, and especially with the endings, so that you will remain nice and relaxed as you're fully confident that you can play it well. I hope then that these ideas will help you get started with this beautiful and iconic piece of music. If you're not already, then please do subscribe to Tommy's Piano Corner. Don't forget to hit that little bell icon so you're notified of new videos as and when they're released. I thank you very much for watching, and we'll see you soon.